The train let her off at Rowanfield in the second week of November, when the aspen had already gone, and the sky above the foothills had that particular gray that meant the season had stopped pretending. There was no one on the platform. She had expected that. The advertisement had said she would be met, but advertisements said a great many things that turned out to be generous estimates. She stood with her bag at her feet and her mother's wool coat buttoned to the throat and looked north along the road that the station master, without being asked, pointed her toward. She thanked him and walked. The road was frozen clay, still rutted from the last wagon that had gone through before the hard cold set in. Her boots were good. Her father had insisted on good boots, which was one of the few pieces of advice she had taken from him that had not disappointed her. She counted the distance in fence posts. There were many missing. Not vandalized, she thought, just not replaced. The kind of thing that happened on a property where the person doing the work had gotten ahead of himself in the wrong direction. The house came into view after 20 minutes. A frame house, 2 stories, white once, now the color of old paper. A barn behind it, hip-roofed, one door hanging open at an angle that suggested the hinge had been meaning to fail for some time and had finally committed. A woodpile against the east wall of the house, not large enough. A paddock to the south, where 3 horses stood with their backs to the wind and their heads down. She counted the horses twice. 3. The advertisement had mentioned 5. She filed that away. The man who answered the door was older than she had pictured, not in years, but in the way a man gets old when he has been managing something too large for himself for too long. His eyes moved to her bag before they moved to her face, which told her something. He was assessing what she'd brought, not who she was. She understood that. When you were running out of things, you started calculating everything you saw. He said her name as a question, though he'd been the one to write it down. She said yes. He said to come in out of the cold. The kitchen was warm, at least. The stove was running, which meant he had managed that much. The room smelled of wood smoke and boiled grain and something underneath those things, the kind of smell that settles into walls when a house has been occupied mainly by someone who has stopped noticing it. Not dirty, not quite. More like a space that had given up on being tended to and had simply become what it was. There were 2 plates on the table. That surprised her. She had not been sure, from the advertisement, whether she would be expected to eat with him or separately. 2 plates was a decision, and decisions told you things. She set her bag by the door and kept her coat on until she could read the room better. He poured coffee without asking if she wanted it, which she took as a point in his favor. He poured it into a mug that had a crack running up the side, sealed with some kind of resin. And she understood that he was the kind of man who repaired things rather than replaced them, which was either frugality or stubbornness, and she would need time to learn which. He said the terms were the same as he'd written. She said she had questions first. He looked at her across the rim of his cup. She said, "The horses." He said he had sold 2 in September. She asked why September specifically. He said there had been a feed bill. She nodded and did not say anything else about the horses yet. She looked at the window instead, the way the light came in flat and gray from the north, the way the glass was single-paned, older installation, the cold already bleeding through it in a thin radiation she could feel from across the room. She asked about the north pasture. He said, "What about it?" She said she had seen it from the road. She said the fence on the northwest corner was down and had been down long enough that the post had sunk. She said there were cattle tracks going through it. He put his cup down. He did not pick it up again for a moment. He said the cattle were in the south field. She said she knew. She had counted them coming up the road. She asked if he was sure he had all of them. He was quiet in the particular way of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to do in front of someone. She waited. He said he was not entirely sure. She said they should ride the fence line in the morning before the next weather came in. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has rearranged something in a room he thought he knew. Not angry, just recalibrating. She asked where she was sleeping. He showed her up the stairs to a room at the back of the house that had a window facing the barn. The bed was made up with military precision, which meant either he had done it for her that morning or it had not been slept in for some time. There was a washstand with a pitcher and a towel folded over the rail. A hook on the back of the door, a small stove, unlit, which she had expected. She would leave it unlit for now. She had slept cold before, and conserving wood mattered more than comfort at this stage of the season. She stood at the window for a moment and looked at the barn. The open door bothered her, not because of the cold, though that mattered, but because of what it said about how things were being managed. A barn door that had been left to fail was a barn where attention had been stretched too thin for too long. She thought about the fence post. She thought about the 2 missing horses. She thought about the feed bill in September. She had seen this before. Not here, but in the same pattern on a different piece of land. The way a property started to let go of itself, one small thing at a time, each small thing manageable on its own, none of them manageable all at once. And the man in the middle of it couldn't see the shape of it anymore because he was standing too close. She turned away from the window and unpacked her bag. She put her things in the dresser in the order she always put them. She set her mother's photograph on the windowsill where she could see it from the bed. She had learned over the years that it helped to have one thing that was entirely hers in any new place. The photograph was that thing. She came back downstairs, and he was at the table with the same paper he'd had before, or a different one. She couldn't tell. He had his reading glasses on now, small wire frames that did not quite suit the rest of his face, and she thought that he had probably gotten them reluctantly and recently. She said, "Tell me about the cattle." He told her. He had started the year with 42 head, which for this parcel was not ambitious but was workable if you managed the patches rotation correctly. He had sold 4 in the fall, 2 before September and 2 in October. He had lost one to a bog crossing in August, which he described in a way that told her the loss still bothered him. He said he thought he had 37 remaining, he said he thought. She asked about the winter feed situation. He was quiet again. She said she could see the hay situation from where she was sitting, she just wanted to hear his version. He said he had brought in 2/3 of what he'd normally put up. He said the summer had been dry, and the first cut was poor, and the second cut he had lost 10 days to a problem with the mower that took time he didn't have to fix. He said he had purchased some additional from a neighbor to the south. She asked how much additional. He said not as much as he needed. She looked at the paper in front of him. She could see from across the table that it was a ledger page, numbers in 2 las, and the column on the right was smaller than the column on the left. She said, "Who else works the property?" He said there was no one now. He said his son had been helping until August. She did not ask what had happened. In Austin, she registered the way he said it, not with anger but with a flatness that meant the wound was still raw enough to keep the surface calm by force, and she stored it alongside the other things she was storing. She said, "I'll start with the fence line tomorrow and the cattle count. Then I want to see the hay situation." He looked at her. She said it mattered more than anything else to know exactly what they had before they decided anything. He said the arrangement he had in mind was more domestic in nature. He had written housekeeper in the advertisement, and he had meant it. He said the farm management was his end of things. She said she understood that. She said she was also telling him what was true. He did not say anything for a long moment. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind shifted and she could hear it work at the corner of the house where the caulking had gone. He said, "All right." She cooked that evening from what she found in the pantry, which was organized in the way a pantry gets organized by a man who puts things back where he finds space rather than where it makes sense. She reorganized it while she cooked, quietly and without announcing she was doing it, putting the staples at hand level and the surplus higher, and the things that needed to be used quickly on the near shelf to the left of the door. He came in once while she was working and stopped when he saw what she was doing, and then said nothing and went back out. She took that as permission. Supper was salt cod and potatoes, which was what there was. She set the table the same way she always set it, cups and plates, and the salt cellar in the center where either person could reach it. He sat down across from her, and they ate. He was not a man who talked when he was eating. She had no problem with that. She had known too many people who talked to fill space and said nothing. Quiet eating with someone told you things. He ate carefully. He did not waste. He kept his elbows off the table, which she had not expected, not out of any snobbery about manners, but because it was a small, precise habit that didn't quite fit the rest of the surface. It was the kind of thing learned as a child and either kept or didn't, and the fact that he had kept it suggested a particular kind of upbringing or a particular kind of self-respect, or both. She said, "Who was on the property before you?" He looked up. She said she meant the house, the way certain things were set up. He said his wife. She said nothing. She looked at her plate. He said she had died 3 years ago. He said it in the way people say things they have learned to say without falling apart, which meant they had practiced saying it until it became a sentence they could manage. She said she was sorry. He said he knew. They finished supper. She washed the dishes and he dried them, standing beside her at the wash basin without being asked to, which she took as another small piece of information. A man who dried dishes without being asked to was a man who understood that labor should be shared, or a man who was trying to be useful and didn't know how else to show it. Either way, she did not mind. She said good night and went upstairs. She lay down on the bed without undressing fully and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house settle. Old frame houses talk to themselves at night. This one had a particular creak in the northeast corner of the roof that came and went with the wind. She tracked it for a while until she understood its pattern, and then she let it go. She thought about the cattle. 37 approximately. For a parcel this size, she had looked at the acreage in the advertisement and compared it against what she'd seen from the road. 37 was undershooting the land's capacity by a fair margin, but undershooting was better than overshooting going into a thin winter. It depended entirely on how much feed there was. She thought about the feed. She thought about the hay she had not yet seen. She closed her eyes and slept. In the morning, she was up before the light changed and found him already at the stove, same as the night before. There was porridge on and the fire was running well. He had his coat on and his boots. He was not a man who moved slowly. In the morning, she had been right about that. They rode out at first light on 2 of the 3 horses, which told her something about which horse he thought she could handle without knowing anything about how she handled horses. He had saddled a short-backed gray mare for her, steady and well-mannered, the kind of animal you gave someone when you were being careful with a stranger. She had been given worse. She said nothing and mounted cleanly, and he watched her do it with an expression that didn't quite change but almost did. They rode the fence line first. She had not asked to lead. She followed his route and watched. The northwest corner was worse than she had thought from the road. 3 posts out and a section of wire down, and the ground around it churned by hooves going through. Not once but many times over what looked like several weeks. The cattle tracks went toward the neighbor's field to the west, which had a different pasture grass. She could see it even from here, lusher, and with better moisture retention in the soil. Of course the cattle had gone through. They always went where the better grass was. She dismounted and looked at the wire. He said he had been meaning to fix that section. She crouched down and looked at the gauge of the wire and the way the break had happened. Not snapped at a post, but pulled loose at the join, which meant the tension had been off for a long time before it finally gave. She straightened up. She asked if he had wire in the barn. He said some. She said they should fix this today, before they rode the south pasture. If there were cattle on the wrong side of this fence, she wanted to know it was closed behind them. He looked at the sky, which was doing what it had been doing since she arrived, holding the possibility of snow without committing. He said all right. They fixed the fence in the cold, working without much conversation. Him setting the posts and her running the wire, because she found she was faster at it, and he did not argue with that. The work took an hour. Her hands were cold through her gloves by the end, the particular cold that settles into your joints and stays. They rode south. The south pasture was larger than she had imagined from the description. It ran down a long, shallow slope toward a creek she could hear before she could see, and the grass in the lower third of the slope was a different species than the top. She could see the transition line even under the thin frost. Someone had managed this land deliberately once, the kind of deliberate that takes years to establish and then persists even after the management lapses. She counted the cattle. 29. She counted again. 29. She told him. He was quiet. She said, so 8 unaccounted for since August. She said it without blame, just as a number you had to have before you could do anything else. He looked across the pasture. He said he had not been out here in 2 weeks. He said the leg had been bad and he had not wanted to push it. She looked at him then. He was sitting his horse with the slight stiffness she had taken for ordinary middle-aged cold. But now that she was looking at it properly, she could see it was concentrated on the left side, not his shoulder, the way the first man had favored his but his hip and lower back, the kind of compensation that built up over years of managing pain that wasn't going away. She did not say what she was thinking. She said, 8 in 2 weeks is not disaster if the fence is closed now. He said they could be anywhere. She said they could. She said the west fence was closed. She asked about the east and north. He said the east fence was solid. He had written it in October. She said they would ride the north line after this. He said the north line was a long ride. She said she knew. He looked at her. She said they had the whole day. They found 4 of the 8 on the north side. On the wrong side of a gap she would not have spotted without looking for it. A place where the wire had been tied rather than properly joined. One of those repairs that held just long enough to stop being a concern and then failed quietly when no one was watching. The cattle were fine. A little thin perhaps, but it was November, and thin was relative. The other 4 they did not find that day. On the ride back she asked about the leg. He did not answer immediately. She waited. He said it was an old injury. He said it did not usually interfere. She could tell from the way he said it that both of those things were partially true and partially which was its own kind of information. She said she was not asking to interfere. She said she was asking because it mattered to know what the property could actually be asked of one person. He looked straight ahead between his horse's ears. She said, "You have been doing the work of 3 people on a property that needs at minimum 2. Something was going to have to give. Things giving was not a failure of character. It was arithmetic." He said nothing for long enough that she thought he was not going to respond. Then he said, "My son left in August because I would not agree to sell the north 40 acres to Grenville." She waited. He said Grenville was the neighbor to the west. He said Grenville had been trying to buy the north 40 for 3 years. He said the north 40 was where the water came from, the natural spring that fed the creek, that fed the south pasture, and gave the whole property its carrying capacity. He said selling it would be selling the lungs of the land. She said, "Your son disagreed." He said his son had said, "Take the money and reduce the operation to something one man could manage." She thought about that. She thought about the grass she had seen in the south pasture, the transition line between species, the deliberate hand behind it. She said, "How long has this property been in your family?" He said, his father had broken the ground here in 1889. He said he had grown up on this land, and his children had grown up on this land. She said, "The creek, does it run year-round?" He said it always had. She said, "Does Grenville's property have a reliable water source?" He said, "Grenville's upper field went dry in August most years." She said, "So what Grenville wants is not the 40 acres. What Grenville wants is the water." He reined in his horse and looked at her. She had not meant it as a revelation. She had meant it as a logical step in the chain. But she could see from his face that it landed differently, that he had known it somewhere beneath the knowing, but had not said it in those words before. And saying it in those words made it a different kind of fact. She said, "I am not telling you anything you do not already know." He said, "No." They rode back to the house without talking much after that. The sky had made a decision, finally, and the first snow was coming down in the particular way it came in November. Not the serious snow, just the announcement of it, light and dry and deliberate. She stabled the horses and brought water and checked the latch on the barn door, which needed more than a latch. It needed the whole hinge rebuilt, but for tonight the latch would hold. She stood in the door of the barn for a moment and listened to the horses settle, and watched the snow come down in the lamplight outside. She thought about the north 40. She thought about the creek. She thought about 29 cattle in a south pasture with a thin winter ahead and not enough hay. She came back to the house and took off her coat and washed her hands at the basin and stood at the window for a moment before she turned around. He was at the table. He had his ledger open and the reading glasses on and the pencil in his hand, but he was not writing. He was looking at the page the way a man looks at something he has looked at so many times that he no longer sees it. She sat down across from him. She said, "May I?" He turned the ledger toward her. She looked at the columns. She had a head for numbers, had always had, the kind of head that read a column of figures the way other people read a sentence, taking in the meaning all at once rather than word by word. What the ledger said was not catastrophic, not yet, but it was not good. The feed bill was the largest problem. The note on the equipment was the second problem. The cattle he was missing were the third. She said, "When does the note come due?" He said, "March." She was quiet. She did the arithmetic. March was manageable if nothing else went wrong. She said, "What else do you have that isn't in here?" He looked at her. She said, "On the land, what haven't you counted?" He said, "The timber on the north slope." She looked up. He said it was not much. He said it was mostly spruce, second growth, nothing worth a mill's attention. But he said there was a stand of mature white birch along the creek edge that a man named LaRue, from the town, had been asking about for 2 years. He said he had not wanted to touch the birch because it was part of what held the creek bank. She said, "Does LaRue want the wood or the bark?" He said the bark. She thought about that. Birch bark harvested correctly, peeled rather than felled, did not kill the tree. She said, "Has LaRue said what he would pay?" He said they had not gotten that far in the conversation. She pulled the ledger a quarter-inch toward her and looked at the March number again. She said, "It would be worth finishing that conversation." He took his glasses off and set them on the table. He looked at her across the lamp, which was turned low, and the light came up between them in a way that made everything in the room feel provisional, as if the darkness was waiting just outside the circle of it. He said, "You are not what I expected." She said, "What did you expect?" He said he wasn't sure. He said the advertisement had been written in a bad week, quickly, without much thought for what he was actually asking for. He said he had expected someone to help with the house. He said he had not thought much beyond that. She understood. She had answered advertisements before, had learned that the gap between what a person wrote and what they actually needed was often where the real situation lived. She said, "The house is fine. The house needs cleaning and the pantry needed organizing and the window in the north room needs new glazing before the deep cold. But none of that is urgent. The land is what is urgent." He was quiet for a long time. The snow was coming down properly. Now she could hear the change in the silence outside, the way falling snow absorbed sound and made the world smaller and more immediate. He said, "My wife knew this land." She waited. He said she had grown up on a homestead in the Pembina Hills, and she had known how to read weather, and she had known the cattle, and she had kept the records in the way his father had kept them, precisely without being asked to. He said after she died, he had kept the records himself, but it was not the same. He could not tell what the records were telling him the way she had been able to tell. She said, "May I see the older records?" He looked at her. She said she meant the ones before 3 years ago. He got up and went to the shelf in the back room and came back with 2 ledgers, older, the covers worn to the texture of old skin. She opened the first one and found a hand she did not recognize, careful and regular, the entries precise and accompanied by small notations in the margin that were not just numbers but observations. Cold came early, lost 2 to the creek, wet spring. East pasture recovered well, moved the bull in June. The voice of someone who was thinking while she wrote, not just recording. She read for a while. He refilled the coffee and set a cup beside her hand and sat back down and did not speak. What she found in the older records was what she had hoped to find but had not been certain of. A pattern, not the pattern of a bad operation struggling, the pattern of a good operation building towards something. The same bull mentioned across 4 seasons, his calves noted with small marks had she eventually decoded as indicating particular traits, constitution, temperament, the ability to gain weight on poor grass. The note stopped 3 years ago. The entries after that were still precise, but the observations were gone. The marginal voice that had been reading the herd's story as well as recording it. She turned to the most recent page. She looked at the descriptions of the cows he was carrying now. She turned back to the older pages and looked for their names. Of the 29 cattle in the south pasture, 11 carried a direct line from the bull in the older records. She could trace it forward. 4 of those 11 were young females who had not yet had a first calf. She picked up the pencil. She said, "Do you know which animals in the south pasture are these 4? She turned the ledger and pointed to the entries. He leaned over and looked. He said yes, he knew them. He said they were the ones who had been hanging back at the south end of the pasture today, away from the main group. She said that was typical for that age and temperament. He looked at her. She said, "Your wife knew what she was building." He sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the particular upward look of a man who is managing something internally with effort. She said she was selecting for constitution, not for weight, not for the market, for the animals that would last. She said it was written in the marginal notes, the same words repeated. "Holds through a hard winter. Good feet, keeps condition on poor feed," he said. She lost her father's entire herd to a winter storm in 1903 when she was 16. She set the pencil down. He said that was the year before he met her. He said she had never spoken of it directly, but it was why she kept the records the way she kept them. She looked at the older ledger in front of her, the careful handwriting, the marginal voice reading the herd as she went. She said she was building a herd that would survive what killed her father's. He said, "Yes." She said, "You have been continuing it." He said, "I didn't know I was. I just kept doing what she started." Outside, the snow was steady now. The real thing. The first proper snowfall of the season coming down in the dark, around the small house and the barn and the south pasture, where 29 cattle stood with their backs to it and held their condition and waited for morning. She told him what she thought they should do. She told him about the 4 young females and why they mattered going into next spring. She told him about the Grenville situation and the water and what she thought the correct response to it was, which was not to sell but to document. To have the creek surveyed and the water rights recorded properly before Grenville got any further in his thinking. She told him about the Birch and LaRue and why that conversation was worth finishing before March. She told him there were things on this land that he was not seeing clearly because he had been standing in the middle of them too long. She said, "I can see them. I am new enough to see them." He looked at her across the table and the lamp. He said, "How long are you thinking of staying?" The question was careful. It was the question of a man who had learned to be careful with questions, who had been asking too many of them in his own head for too long, and had gotten out of the habit of asking them out loud. She looked at the 2 ledgers open in front of her. She looked at the marginal notes in the handwriting that had stopped 3 years ago. She thought about the 4 young cows in the south pasture. She said, long enough to see what those 4 look like after their first calving season. He was still for a moment, she said. That will be spring at the earliest, possibly the spring after. The snow ticked, the snow pressed in around the house on all sides. The quiet insistence of a plains night making itself known, he said. All right. She did not say anything else. She turned back to the ledger and kept reading, going back further, looking for the beginning of the pattern his wife had started, and he had continued without knowing it. The 2 of them together on the page even now, the careful hand and the less careful hand. The record of something that had been built toward a future neither of them had entirely articulated. She stayed through the winter. She found the 4 missing cattle in December, 3 on the wrong side of the east fence, where a section had come down under a fallen birch, and 1 in the creek bottom with a bad leg she splinted and hand-fed through January. The leg healed. Not perfectly, but enough. The hay held because she rationed it precisely and sourced an additional half-load from a family named Guthrie, 12 miles east, whom she had met at the feed merchants and spoken to directly in the way she spoke to most people, without preamble, about what she needed. The Guthries had surplus. They were glad to sell it. It was the kind of transaction that happened when someone was paying attention to what was available instead of only to what was lacking. She finished the conversation with LaRue in January. He wanted the bark, not the wood. The price he offered was fair, and she negotiated it to slightly better than fair, which was not difficult because she knew what the bark was worth. And LaRue, it turned out, did not think she would. The money went toward the March note and left a small remainder. In February, she wrote a letter to the land office in Edmonton about the water rights on the North Spring. The surveyor came in March, as soon as the frost was out enough. The rights were recorded in April. She attended the recording and she made sure the clerk spelled everything correctly. The Grenville conversation, when it came, was brief. He came to the property in May with an offer in hand and found her in the north pasture moving a temporary fence. He introduced himself. She told him the water rights had been recorded. He stood with his offer in his hand and looked at it, and then folded it and put it in his coat pocket and left. She watched him go and then went back to the fence. Spring calving was good. The 4 young cows the ledger had led her to were exactly what the older records had promised they would be. Strong deliveries, no rejections. The calves that came were the kind of calves you could tell immediately would be worth something. Not flashy, not big for their age, but solid, even-tempered, with the kind of quiet constitution that would tell its story in years rather than seasons. She wrote it all down in the ledger, in her own hand, a third voice joining the other 2. He did not ask again how long she intended to stay. By the second winter, they had stopped talking about it, because the answer had been given in a way that did not require saying. She had turned the North Field over to winter wheat, a decision she had researched over 2 months and proposed carefully, and that he had argued against for the right reasons and agreed to for the right reasons. The wheat came in well the following summer. Not spectacular, but solid. Another voice in the ledger. She found, over time, that she knew the land in the way you come to know any living thing, not all at once, and never completely, but through accumulated attention. She knew which fence post would go next in a hard wind. She knew which of the cattle would be the last to find shelter and which would be first to water. And which one, the old roan she had watched through 3 calving seasons, would stand at the south gate in the early morning as if she were checking something, some count of the world, before deciding to go back to the grass. She knew the particular quality of the light on the east slope in late October, when the shadows went long and amber and the whole property looked, just for that hour, like something preserved. She was outside the morning the letter came from his son. He read it at the kitchen table without saying what was in it, and she did not ask. She could see from the set of his shoulders that it was not a bad letter. She could see from the way he set it down that it was not entirely a good one either. She came in and poured her coffee and sat across from him, and they looked at each other for a moment. He said, "He is thinking about coming back." She said, "What do you think?" He said he thought it depended on a number of things, she said. "Then tell him that." He said he would. He looked at her across the table in the particular morning light, the gray November light that had been the light of her arrival, and that she had long since stopped noticing as anything but the ordinary light of where she lived. He said, "It is a different place than it was." She said, "It is the same place. It just got to be what it was going to be." 32 years later, a woman driving south on a road she did not know well, stopped to ask directions at a farm outside Rowanfield. The man who came to the gate was young, perhaps 30, with the look of someone who had grown up outside and had no problem with that. She asked about the road to Claresholm. He pointed south and gave her the turns. Then he paused and told her that if she had a moment she should look at the south pasture before she went. He said his grandmother had built that herd and it was about the best thing in the county. She looked where he pointed. The pasture ran down a long, gentle slope toward a creek, and the cattle on it were the kind you stopped to look at without knowing why, just a quality in the way they stood that suggested something had gone right for a long time. She asked who his grandmother was. He said she had come to the property in 1923 and had stayed. He said she had come to help for the winter and had never quite left, which was how he'd always heard it told. The woman thanked him and drove on. He went back through the gate and latched it behind him and walked down to check the south fence. The same fence his grandmother had walked 100 times in all weathers, looking for what needed doing and finding it the way she always had.